If you're a fan of anime, chances are you've heard of a company called Funimation. And if you've heard of Funimation, chances are you've probably heard recently that the end of Funimation is in sight. The company has announced that on April 2nd, it will be permanently shutting down its streaming service, as well as retiring the name Funimation altogether. And as someone who grew up in the 2000s consuming as much anime as possible, it's a little surreal to see a name as big as Funimation just vanish. But let's say that you don't watch anime, or you're just now getting into it, or maybe you don't really keep up to date with the behind the scenes of how your favorite shows are brought to you, and you have no idea what a Funimation is. Essentially, Funimation is a company dedicated to the licensing, distribution, and localization of anime in the western part of the world. This includes physical media like DVDs and Blu-rays, streaming services like the Funimation app, and of course, English language production, having created numerous legendary English dubs for shows like Yu Yu Hakusho, Full Metal Alchemist, and Fruits Basket. The company has stood as a titan in the Western anime industry for decades at this point, but this wasn't always the case. Of course, anime had existed in the West before Funimation. In fact, there were several popular shows that had aired on television throughout the years, like Astro Boy, Speed Racer, and Voltron. However, despite these shows' successes, none of them really put anime on the map in the greater cultural zeitgeist. At best, they were just seen as your typical American cartoon, no different from Scooby-Doo or Masters of the Universe. And at worst, they were seen as weird. Awful English dubs aside, there was also the issue of the massive cultural dissonance between America and Japan. You have to understand, in these days, the internet didn't exist, meaning that the world in a sense still had barriers all around it. A wide audience of American viewers hadn't been exposed to Japanese culture, meaning that many of these shows would come off as a hard sell for an English-speaking audience. To mitigate this, many anime that were imported to America would be drastically changed to be less jarring to an American audience. This is why many anime from this time were not seen as anime, but simply American cartoons. And this, combined with a general lack of interest in the US market from Japanese studios, meant that any exposure and growth for anime would stagnate for the foreseeable future. That is, until the release of Akira. Akira is heralded as one of the most influential pieces of Japanese media ever created, and is often cited as the turning point for anime as a global industry. If you had grown up watching anime like Speed Racer or Astro Boy, going from that to Akira was like going from playing with a harmless puppy to wrestling a full-grown grizzly bear. Akira's dark, cyberpunk world, complex story, and well-developed characters, all brought to life through masterful animation, showed Western audiences exactly what anime is and could be. The spark had been lit for the rise of anime in the States. All that was left was for people to take advantage of that spark and turn it into a raging fire. And one of those people was Gen Fukunaga. Gen Fukunaga was born on March 22, 1962. Although he was born in Japan, he moved to the United States very soon after, and because of this, Fukunaga lived on the threshold of both American and Japanese culture. He lived in Indiana for a large portion of his life, but spent his 8th grade year of school studying in Japan. It's here that Fukunaga was able to immerse himself in the world of manga and anime, an industry that, while stagnating in the West, was thriving in the East. As Fukunaga continued to grow into adulthood, he found himself asking the same question over and over again. Why was an industry that was flourishing in Japan basically non-existent in the States? Being the natural entrepreneur he was, Fukunaga understood when an opportunity presented itself. And thus, he quit his job and began down the path of making anime mainstream in the West. Fukunaga needed two things. One, he would need to build a company from scratch in which he could conduct his business through. And two, in order to sell product, he would need to acquire the license for an anime. So with this in mind, Fukunaga aimed for the stars in his search for potential licenses. And this would inevitably lead him to one of the leaders in Japanese anime, Toei Animation. If you've had even a passing interest in anime, chances are you've probably heard of any number of shows that Toei Animation has worked on. One Piece, Digimon, and Sailor Moon being just a few examples. Toei had been an animation juggernaut for 3 decades up to this point, so it made sense Fukunaga would seek out one of their shows when deciding what it was he wanted to license. However, Fukunaga knew that if he was going to build a thriving business, he couldn't settle on the license for just any anime. He needed a heavy hitter, something that would grab the attention of the US audience like nothing ever had. He needed Dragon Ball Z. I need to explain what Dragon Ball Z is to any of you. You know what it is. Rather, what you need to understand is that Dragon Ball Z was by far the most popular show Toei Animation had made up to this point, retaining very consistent ratings not only after its premiere, but throughout its entire 7-year run into 1996. It was incredibly popular with the Japanese audience, so of course Fukunaga naturally set his sights on Dragon Ball Z as the first anime he would license for American release. And he was promptly rejected. Keep in mind, Japanese studios in the early 90s were still in the same headspace they had been in for decades. When focusing solely on the domestic Japanese market, Toei had seen consistent success, whereas attempts to reach out to the American market didn't go nearly as well. Toei's first attempt to bring Dragon Ball to the West was in the late 80s through a US production company called Harmony Gold. This dub was met with mediocre results, and to this day, it's seen as this bizarre relic in Dragon Ball history.
I'm not sure what it is yet, but you sure do look kind of different to me. That's because I'm a girl.
It was this lack of return on investment that made Toei hesitant to reattempt any kind of localization for its biggest cash cow. If he was going to make anime mainstream in America, Fukunaga would need a show like Dragon Ball Z to head the charge. Luckily for him, Fukunaga had a connection in Toei, specifically his uncle, who worked as a producer in the company. Through his uncle, Fukunaga was finally able to secure the license to Dragon Ball Z, though there was a caveat. He would not only need to pay around $1 million for the license, but he would also need to build a production company that could produce the English localization of the show. Having made it this far, and seeing how an anime like Dragon Ball Z could appeal to the US market in a big way, Fukunaga decided the potential for success outweighed the risk. And so, after convincing a coworker and his family to invest millions of dollars into his plan, Funimation was born. This is when things got really complicated. From the start, Funimation was plagued by issues on a regular basis. On the Japanese side of things, business moved at a glacial pace. Anything Funimation did had to be approved by Toei, a process that often took months on end. Not helping things was Funimation's lack of money. If they wanted to get the series off the ground, they would need to strike a deal with an outside distributor. This would only lead to even more problems, the show's highly serialized nature and inconsistent status quo proving to be unappealing to many potential business partners. And finally, was the issue of the series itself. It's well known at this point that Dragon Ball Z is a follow-up to the original Dragon Ball. While overshadowed by Z in terms of sheer success, Dragon Ball was still a major hit in Japan and served as the origin for many key characters going into Z. This was the beginning of the story, so it only made sense for Funimation to start here and work their way up to Z. The problem is that once a dub was finally produced, it did horribly. Out the gate, Dragon Ball was met with mediocre network ratings, and this was due to a few things. For one, the show was given an abysmal early morning time slot, meaning that barely anyone even knew it existed, and anyone that did see it was more than likely put off by it. Dragon Ball is a goofy anime, and that's not a bad thing, but at the time, it's easy to see how an anime like Dragon Ball would fail to connect with an American audience. This led to only 13 episodes being produced, before ultimately being deemed a failure, and thus, the end of Funimation was imminent. Or so it seemed. Dragon Ball had failed to garner an audience in America, but what if Funimation just skipped Dragon Ball and went straight into Dragon Ball Z? A strategy like this was risky. It would mean skipping a considerable amount of story and potentially confusing their audience. That being said, Dragon Ball's lack of impact didn't leave Funimation with many options left on the table. And so, they bet it all on Dragon Ball Z. After airing, Dragon Ball Z would go on to build its ratings, being shown on several different TV stations before being picked up by Cartoon Network's Toonami block in 1998. It's here that all eyes were on the show, and it was unlike anything that had come before it. Dragon Ball Z's dark edge and heavy emphasis on action appealed to the testosterone-obsessed little boys of America in a way that no other show could dream of. And it's through this audience that Dragon Ball Z would carve its way to pop culture immortality. Toys, clothes, video games, Dragon Ball Z had taken America by storm, and in the process obliterated the cultural walls for anime in the States. Shows like Pokemon, Sailor Moon, and Gundam Wing would become television juggernauts. And this, combined with the advent of the internet, meant that fans had an outlet to talk about these shows and where they came from. To put it simply, this was the golden age of anime in the United States. Japanese studios now more willing than ever to sell their properties to the American market, and Funimation was caught in the middle of all of it. Dragon Ball Z's immense popularity was proof that Funimation could produce a smash hit in America. This newfound credibility allowing the company to license anime after anime after anime. They had essentially become the go-to company if you wanted your show to be released in America. And it was with this reputation that they were able to single-handedly dominate the American anime industry, and would continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Funimation played a key role in anime's rise to the American mainstream. However, the price of making something mainstream is that everyone will want in on it. There's been several companies like Funimation through the years. 4Kids and Viz Media are two of the best examples, but even then, they still didn't enjoy the same level of control over the industry that Funimation did. A level of control that would go unchallenged for years. That is, until the advent of streaming. In this day and age, streaming is the go-to method for media consumption. It's as natural as breathing at this point. However, by the 2010s, Funimation made most of its income through physical media. They were very much a company that were focused on the sales of their DVDs and Blu-rays. So, when a new streaming service called Crunchyroll began to eat away at their market share, they were caught off guard. Crunchyroll was able to set itself apart by being a streaming service completely dedicated to anime, and what helped them gain an immense amount of traction were the deals they were able to strike with Japanese television broadcasters. These deals would allow Crunchyroll to upload new episodes of popular anime like Naruto Shippuden to their service the day they premiered in Japan. This, combined with Crunchyroll's priority to produce English subs instead of dubs, meant that they were able to work at a much quicker pace for a fraction of the cost. Crunchyroll was making a big splash in the American anime industry, and they weren't the only ones with their eyes on Funimation's crown. By this point, giant companies like Netflix and Amazon had seen the potential increase anime could bring to their revenue streams, and so they would begin to outbid Funimation for anime licenses, going so far as to double the amount Funimation was willing to pay for these licenses. These companies wanted the biggest hits, and Funimation's reputation could no longer guarantee that they wouldn't be able to get them. Funimation was a titan of the industry, but it had found itself in the ring with gods. The writing was on the wall. Funimation needed to be sold. In July of 2017, Sony announced that it would buy a 95% stake in Funimation for $143 million, effectively owning the company. And this was a pretty big deal for several different reasons. On one hand, it meant that Funimation would be able to throw around the same money its competitors were when acquiring new licenses. On the other hand, it also meant that Funimation was now a company owned by Sony, part of an astronomically bigger entity than itself. And this has been a trend. Corporations buying well-known properties and companies to add to their already massive media empires. I don't think it's hyperbole to say Sony has its eyes on completely consuming the American anime market. And if you need even more proof of this, Sony would go on to buy Crunchyroll, Funimation's main competitor, for over $1 billion, merging the two companies and discarding the Funimation name altogether. At the time of this video, Funimation's streaming service, which has run since 2016, will be the last product that bears the Funimation name. The service scheduled to shut down on April 2nd, 2024. And there's upsides and downsides to this. For one, a lot of Funimation's library is moving to Crunchyroll, which means that all the anime you could ever want will conveniently be in one place. However, with Sony now owning two of the biggest names in Western anime distribution, they can now charge as much as they want. And isn't it interesting how the moment Funimation announces the end of its streaming service, Crunchyroll immediately announces it's increasing its prices from $55 a year to $100 a year? It's kind of funny how that works, isn't it? It's very interesting timing. I wonder if those two correlate. Anyway. Ultimately, what this all boils down to is that Funimation isn't technically gone. It lives on with a different name. However, the Funimation we knew, it is gone. The Funimation we knew was a massive pillar for anime in America. The Funimation we know now is anime in America. Alright, that's going to be it for the video today, guys. Go ahead and comment below your thoughts on the whole Funimation debacle. There's a lot of people seem to be up in arms about it. And hey, while you're at it, why don't you go check out the top 5 saddest anime deaths. Spoilers, just so you know, there's spoilers in that video. I mean, it should be pretty obvious, but yeah, there's spoilers. Till next time, guys, take care.